On the night of February 12, 1542, a teenage girl in the Tower of London made a strange request. She asked her jailers to carry the executioner's block into her chamber. Then, by candlelight, the Queen of England knelt down and practiced laying her head on it again and again so she wouldn't falter in the morning. History remembers Catherine Howard as the foolish girl who cheated on Henry VIII, but the real story is far darker, because Catherine Howard was never actually put on trial. And the thing that killed her was one of the most chilling laws ever written in England. Catherine Howard's story begins with almost nothing. Her exact birth date was never recorded. Modern historians place it somewhere between 1522 and 1525, and that missing piece of paper would one day matter more than anyone could have guessed. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a younger son of the mighty Duke of Norfolk, which sounds impressive until the details come in. Edmund was broke, unlucky, and drowning in debts, with roughly 10 children to feed. Catherine was just one mouth among many, and when she was still a small child, perhaps only 3, perhaps 6, her mother, Joyce, died. So the Howards did what great families did with surplus daughters. They shipped her off. Catherine was placed in the sprawling household of her step-grandmother, Agnes, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. First at Chesworth House in Sussex, later at Lambeth, just across the river from the royal court. On paper, it was a respectable, aristocratic finishing school. In reality, it was a crowded, loosely supervised dormitory where dozens of young gentlewomen slept behind doors that were supposed to be locked, and often weren't. The Duchess was elderly, distracted, and rarely paying attention. A motherless girl, an absent father, a grandmother who didn't watch. In that house, Catherine Howard would learn lessons no child should learn, and every one of them would come back for her. The first man was her music teacher. Around 1536, when Catherine was in her early teens, possibly as young as 13. If the later birth estimates are right, a musician named Henry Manox was hired to teach her the virginals. Manox was an adult. Catherine was his student, and by her own later account, the lessons did not stay lessons. She would eventually confess that Manox touched the most intimate parts of her body, though both insisted it never went further than that. Manox even boasted to others of knowing a privy mark on her body, a secret detail he had no honest reason to know. Some modern historians describe what happened as grooming, plain and simple. Others caution that the 16th century had no such category, and that the surviving testimony speaks of participation on both sides. What no one disputes is the gap in age, in power, in duty of care. He was the teacher, she was the child. And Manox was only the beginning. By around 1538, a new man had entered the household. Francis Dereham, a gentleman in the Duchess's service. Older, confident, and interested in Catherine. This time, it went all the way. In her confession years later, Catherine admitted that Dereham, used me in such sort as a man doth his wife. Many times, she said, over many nights. Other women in the dormitory confirmed it. Derham slipped into the maid's chamber after dark. He and Catherine called each other husband and wife. He openly bragged that he would marry her. To the household, it was an open secret. Stolen food smuggled into the dormitory, whispered visits, a teenage girl and a grown man playing at marriage under a roof where nobody in charge cared enough to stop it. Here is the detail that turns the stomach. Her family knew. Later investigations made it clear that people around the Dowager Duchess were aware of what Manox and Dereham had done. And yet, when the moment came, the Howards didn't shelter their damaged girl. They polished her up and aimed her at the King of England. In late 1539, Catherine was appointed Maid of Honour to Henry VIII's incoming fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. It was a plum position, almost certainly arranged through her uncle Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, one of the most ruthless political operators of the entire Tudor age. Whether the Howards deliberately dangled their pretty teenage niece in front of the king, or simply seized the opportunity when his eye wandered, is something historians still debate. Either way, the outcome was the same. Henry noticed her almost immediately, and Henry VIII in 1540 was not the golden athlete of the portraits. He was 49 years old, enormously overweight, with a festering ulcerated leg that reportedly had to be drained and stank when it flared. He was paranoid, volatile, and fresh from a marriage he despised. By April 1540, this man was showering a girl of perhaps 15 to 18 with gifts, lands, fine fabrics, attention no one could refuse. Refusing a Tudor king was not a survivable career move, least of all for a Howard girl whose entire family was pushing her forward. Events moved with brutal speed. On July 9, 1540, Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. 19 days later, on July 28th, he privately married Catherine Howard at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. She was, at most, in her late teens. He was 49. And on that very same day, across London, Henry had his former chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, beheaded. That is the world Catherine married into. A wedding morning and an execution sharing a date. The court she now ruled as queen was a place where the man kissing her hand had killed his own right hand hours earlier. For a little while, though, it looked like a fairy tale. Catherine was showered with jewels. She ordered fashionable French hoods to replace the severe English style of the previous queens. Household accounts show a teenager delighting in pretty things, which is, in the end, exactly what she was. The schoolbooks love to say, Henry called her his rose without a thorn. He didn't. That famous nickname was invented 300 years later by a Victorian writer who misread the Latin motto on a coin. A motto that actually referred to Henry himself and had been in use since the 1520s. The real Catherine got no poetic nickname. What she got, instead, was far worse. Because the men from Lambeth had noticed exactly who was wearing the crown. Francis Dereham came to court, and in one of the most jaw-dropping decisions of the whole story, he was appointed to the Queen's own household as her secretary. Why would Catherine hire the man who could destroy her with a single sentence? Later interrogations suggested a grim answer. People from the old household were being quietly rewarded, and Dereham seems to have understood precisely what his silence was worth. Some historians read it bluntly as blackmail. At minimum, it was a girl trying desperately to bury her past by paying its witnesses. Every appointment was a confession waiting to happen. Every familiar face from Lambeth was a loaded gun in the palace. And then Catherine made her fatal connection. In the spring of 1541, the Queen began meeting privately with Thomas Culpeper, a handsome young gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, and one of Henry's personal favourites. The meetings were arranged by her lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, a woman who had already survived the destruction of Anne Boleyn, her own sister-in-law, and somehow chose to walk back into the fire. Through the summer of 1541, as the royal court made its grand progress through the north of England, Lincoln, Pontefract, Lady Rochford smuggled Culpeper up back stairs and through unlocked doors for secret late-night conversations with the Queen. Were they lovers? Under interrogation, both flatly denied that anything physical ever happened, though Culpeper made the devastating admission that they had intended to do ill. The Crown never proved adultery. What survives is a single letter, the only letter in Catherine's hand still in existence, badly spelled, anxious, and ending with the sign-off, "Yours as long as life endures." For centuries, it was read as a love letter. Some modern historians read it very differently, as the panicked note of a frightened young woman trying to manage a powerful courtier, not a romance at all. The truth of those meetings will likely never be known. What is certain is what they cost. On November 2nd, 1541, All Souls' Day, Henry VIII walked into his private pew at Hampton Court and found a letter waiting for him. It had been left there by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, because the Archbishop did not dare say its contents out loud. A former Lambeth chambermaid named Mary Lascelles had talked. The letter laid out Catherine's past. Manox, Dereham, the dormitory, all of it. Henry initially refused to believe a word. Then the investigation started pulling threads, and the whole tapestry came apart. According to the French ambassador, when the evidence became undeniable, the King of England broke down and wept in front of his council, and reportedly called for a sword so he could kill Catherine himself. What happened next was not a trial. It was a demolition. Cranmer went to interrogate the Queen and found not a scheming adulteress, but a hysterical teenager. His own letter to Henry describes her in such a frenzy of terror that he feared for her sanity. So severe that orders were given to remove anything from her rooms she might use to harm herself. The Archbishop, to his limited credit, sat with her gently while she wept until she could not speak. Then he took down every word she gasped out, because compassion and evidence-gathering were, for Cranmer, the same errand. On November 7th and 8th, Catherine signed written confessions detailing what Manox and Dereham had done to her years before she ever met the king. And buried in that interrogation was a single, glittering escape hatch. One legal loophole that could have saved her life. Cranmer came bearing a promise of the king's mercy if she confessed to a pre-contract with Dereham. A binding promise of marriage, which in Tudor law functioned almost like marriage itself. It sounds like a trap. It was actually a lifeline, and what Catherine did with it decided everything. That door and why it slammed shut is the darkest part of this entire story, and it comes at the end. On November 22nd, she was stripped of the title of Queen and confined at Sion House. She had worn the crown for roughly 18 months. Then the men began to die. On December 10th, 1541, Francis Dereham, who had begged to be spared the full traitor's death, was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, one of the most gruesome executions English law could inflict. Thomas Culpeper, as a gentleman and a former royal favourite, was granted the mercy of a simple beheading. Culpeper, incidentally, had not gone down protecting Catherine. Under interrogation, he blamed her, claiming she had pursued him. This from a man to whom she had sent a rich gold chain as a token. She had bought his goodwill with Tudor gold. He sold her at the first sight of the interrogators. Both men's heads were tarred and set on spikes on London Bridge. 65 days later, it was her turn. On February 10th, 1542, Catherine was taken by barge down the Thames to the Tower of London. The route ran directly beneath London Bridge, where the rotting heads of Dereham and Culpeper still stood on their spikes. Whether she looked up, no source can say. The ambassador Chapuys noted the grim geography, and the rest is imagination. But the Tudor state did not choose that route by accident. Her last journey as a free-breathing woman passed under a preview of her own destruction. On the evening of February 12th, she was told she would die the next morning. And this is where the story returns to that candlelit chamber. Catherine Howard. Somewhere between 17 and 20 years old, the exact number unknowable because no one had bothered to record a poor Howard daughter's birth, asked for the block. Not a priest first, not a letter, the block. The ambassador Chapuys and a London merchant named Otwell Johnson both recorded it. She wanted to rehearse her own beheading so that her body would not betray her at the end. A teenager, alone in the tower, practicing how to die correctly. It may be the single most heartbreaking documented moment of the entire Tudor age. The next morning, February 13th, 1542, at around 9 o'clock, Catherine was led out to Tower Green. She was reportedly so weak she could barely stand or speak. The legend says she declared from the scaffold, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." She said no such thing. That line comes from a single wildly unreliable Spanish chronicle written years later. A source so confused it gets the order of the executions wrong. The eyewitnesses who were actually there, including Johnson, recorded something smaller and sadder. A conventional, pious speech, acknowledging her offences and asking for prayers. Then she knelt at the block she had practiced on. The axe fell once. Moments later, on the same scaffold, still wet with the Queen's blood, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was beheaded too. Catherine's body was buried that same day under the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a few steps from where she died, near the bones of her cousin Anne Boleyn. But the question underneath everything is the one the schoolbooks never ask. Henry VIII executed one wife, Anne Boleyn, after a trial. A rigged trial, but a trial, with judges and a verdict. Catherine Howard got nothing of the kind. No courtroom, no jury, no chance to answer a single charge. So how does a king legally kill a queen without trying her? The answer is that Parliament built him a brand new law, designed around one specific teenage girl. By late November 1541, the investigators had a problem. The premarital affairs with Monnox and Dereham were shameful, but they happened before the marriage. They weren't treason. And adultery with Culpeper, the one thing that was treason, could not be proven. Both parties denied it to the end. Under existing law, the case for killing Catherine was a mess. So the law was changed. On January 21st, 1542, a Bill of Attainder was introduced in Parliament. It simply declared Catherine guilty and sentenced her to death by legislative decree, and it went further. The act made it high treason for any unchaste woman to marry the king without first disclosing her past. A crime invented after the fact and applied backwards to conduct from years earlier by a girl who may have been 13 when it began. The act received royal assent on February 11th, 1542. She was dead within 48 hours. Catherine Howard was not executed because adultery was proven. She was executed because Parliament passed a law that made her past. The abuse shadowed past of an unsupervised child at Lambeth, retroactively punishable by death. And the escape hatch? The pre-contract with Dereham. If Catherine had confessed that she'd been legally promised to him, her marriage to Henry could arguably have been void from the start. No marriage, no treason against a husband. And Cranmer had dangled the king's mercy for exactly that admission. She refused. She insisted Dereham had forced her and denied any binding promise. Perhaps she was telling the truth. Perhaps, as some historians suspect, a terrified teenager simply could not grasp that admitting the most shameful version of her past was the only version that ended with her alive. The one confession that could have saved her was the one she would not make. As for the family that put her on the throne, the Duke of Norfolk did not lift a finger. As the net closed, her uncle raced to save himself, writing to Henry and denouncing his own false and traitorous nieces lumping Catherine together with Anne Boleyn. The two girls his family had fed to the same king, condemned in a single grovelling sentence. It worked for a while, but the Tudor wheel kept turning. Within 5 years, Norfolk himself was locked in the Tower under his own bill of attainder, stripped of everything, waiting for the axe, and was spared only because Henry VIII died hours before the sentence could be carried out. The man who watched two nieces walk to the block spent years staring at the door, wondering when his own turn would come. Catherine Howard rests today under a Victorian marble marker in the Tower Chapel. Her bones never examined, her true age never established, her face never certainly captured in any surviving portrait. History called her a fool and a wanton for 4 centuries. The record calls her something else. A motherless girl handed to men at 13, sold to a king at perhaps 17, and killed at maybe 19. By a law that had to be invented, because nothing she had actually done was a crime. Thanks for watching History's Hidden Lives. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.